Today's video is the beginning of a deep dive into the problem of divine hiddenness, which, while I'm not particularly keen on in terms of an argument against the existence of God, it is something atheists seem to latch onto, mostly as a response to Christians who latch onto the concept that God actually does things directly in the world today. Now, I may not tackle the presenter's entire video in this reply. His video is pretty long on its own, and my reply would likely end up necessarily being roughly 2 hours long, so I may answer the whole thing, I may not, or I may split this up into multiple parts. I don't know. We'll see how I feel.
One of the two stronger arguments for atheism today is called the problem of divine hiddenness. Now, Alex O'Connor is probably one of the more famous atheists on YouTube, and he's a big proponent of this, so I thought I'd let him and his friend Joe describe it.
If you ask people, especially people who haven't spent a lot of time doing philosophy of religion or whatever, just why don't you believe in God? It's I don't know, man. I just sort of, he's just not there, you know? I've never felt him, I've never seen him, I've never seen any evidence.
I'm going to offer 6 considerations or critiques of this argument. It is not the knockdown, drag-out argument against Christianity that some feel it is.
And I agree with this sentiment, though the presenter and I disagree wildly on why the divine hiddenness argument is so weak. Before we can even get onto whether divine hiddenness is a compelling argument, we have to acknowledge that the definition of God itself often shifts so drastically between sects of Christianity and even individuals that any argument for or against divine presence runs the risk of being redirected midstream. This conceptual vagueness makes it hard to even establish the criteria by which hiddenness would be a problem. Are we talking about the Christian God who wants a relationship, or a deistic God who simply watches, or an impersonal force that transcends comprehension? From an atheist standpoint, there's an even deeper issue. Before we can ask why God is hidden, we should ask what is supposedly hiding. If the term God is so ill-defined or metaphorical that it cannot be coherently analyzed, then the problem of divine hiddenness dissolves, not because it is solved, but because the subject is too poorly defined to generate a meaningful problem in the first place.
I want to say I sympathize with those of you who might genuinely have trouble believing that God exists. If you're that way, I just want you to know that I can relate to you. There have been times in my life in which I really did struggle, and I think I had personal reasons for this, but I questioned whether or not God existed. And I want to give you some advice in the end.
So the presenter starts off with this, offering sympathy to people who have trouble believing that a God exists. I'm not wholly sure who he's referring to here, as he seems to be referencing people that think like him, rather than all atheists who simply lack a belief or strongly do not believe that a God exists. Rather, he appears to be addressing people who may already have a belief, may be struggling with their faith, or are struggling with the concept of atheism in general, but simultaneously struggling with the concept of a God. If that's the case, then, well, there's really nothing for me to comment on. So I'm really not going to spend too much time critiquing this, but I will say that it's rather odd to create a video addressing a supposed problem all atheists have, then only address people who may not even qualify as being atheists. This really just solidifies my belief that the religious create content for people who are already religious, and not for the already non-religious or people who actively engage in counter-apologetics. To me, it's a lot like somebody making a video about Pokemon trashing Digimon fans. Yeah, I guess I understand, but to address a different fan base like that is really pointless. On its own, this isn't a major issue, but it highlights a recurring problem in theistic discourse, misrepresenting who their critiques are actually aimed at. If you're going to create a video addressing a supposed problem that atheists have, then it's important to engage with non-belief as a sincere, reasoned position, not just a phase of emotional struggle. If it's meant for wavering belief, that's a different topic entirely, and should be framed as such. Basically, don't advertise a mojito when what you're really serving is Sprite.
But first, let me start by saying I think that this argument is far too simplistic. Too simplistic about God, and too simplistic about us. My first objection is that for all of the people who feel that it should be more obvious that God exists, or that they don't feel that he exists, this is countered by the far greater number of people who definitely have a sense of the divine, or a drawing towards the divine. When asked why he doesn't believe in God, Alex says he just doesn't feel it. But in another video Alex makes with a different friend, he points out that probably the vast majority of people feel drawn towards God.
Now, just a note for the viewers here, the presenter does a decent job of recapping Alex O'Connor's positions. While he doesn't steelman Alex's statements, he doesn't strawman them either, so for the sake of brevity, I'm going to cut out Alex O'Connor's portion of his video. The presenter starts by calling the divine hiddenness argument too simplistic about God and too simplistic about us. His first objection is that for all people who say it should be more obvious that God exists, there's a much larger group who do feel the presence of the divine, as if that somehow cancels the objection out. Now, formally, this is just an appeal to popularity fallacy. Saying lots of people feel it doesn't refute the problem, it just dodges it. Now, I could end my response here as it's a valid rebuttal on its own, but that's a bit too much lazy hand-waving for my liking. Politicians jerk themselves off enough for all of us, so let's tackle this empirically using statistical analysis. If we're going to explore the statistical route here, then the burden is on the presenter to back his claim with real data. And this is where things immediately begin to fall apart, because he appears to be conflating two very different things: people who identify as religious and people who actually report feeling the divine. That's a big problem. I couldn't find any credible data that meaningfully separates those groups. Good statistics need well-defined categories, and are you religious is a very different question from do you feel a divine presence? The answers to those two might overlap, but they also might not, and assuming they have a 100% correlation without evidence is just sloppy. Also, if you're actually trying to study this sociologically, the questions you ask have to be non-leading. If you ask someone, "Are you religious?" and then immediately follow up with, "Do you feel the divine within you?" then congratulations, you've just primed your respondent. You're not measuring belief or experience anymore, you're measuring suggestibility. You've got to act like a scientist, not a cop. And yes, there are entire academic fields, sociology, psychology, religious studies, dedicated to getting these questions right. People spend their entire careers learning how to design surveys that don't bake in assumptions or bias into the outcome. This is hard stuff, so much so that there are people with doctorates in how to not screw this up. But let's take a step back. Even if you could gather good data, there's still a massive elephant in the room. What does feeling the divine even mean? Because if you're going to make that claim, you need to define it. What is this feeling? Is it emotional warmth? A sense of awe? Goosebumps when you hear a choir? When do people feel it? Constantly? Only in church? Only when they consciously think about it after being asked? Does it only happen after events like church? Or does this feeling occur spontaneously, like when they're stuck in traffic on the way to work? And how do you tell the difference between feeling the divine and just feeling something profound? This isn't a rhetorical nitpick, it's a real methodological problem. If your entire argument hinges on people feeling the divine, then the divine has to mean something more than "this gave me feelings." Yes, there are researchers out there, neurotheology, psychologists, who've tried to pin this stuff down, but there's no consensus, no universally accepted definitions across both theological and secular scholars of what this divine feeling actually is, which makes it a pretty fragile foundation for any serious argument. So from an empirist standpoint, the claim lots of people feel the divine isn't a useful objection. It's emotionally satisfying, maybe, but logically, it's hollow. There's a huge difference between having a feeling and that feeling corresponding with reality. Lots of people feel connected to the universe, to nature, to each other. Calling it divine doesn't make some unified cosmic mind ontologically real, it just makes it marketable.
So I do think right away this should be a clue. If the majority of people throughout human history, not just now, but in various cultures now and throughout human history in our own culture, have known that the transcendent layer of reality exists, that objective, in some sense, real morality is something embedded in the world, that beauty exists, that free will in some sense exists, and that God exists.
There's quite a bit of assumption baked into the presenter's argument here, and I did ask for clarification from the presenter because I didn't want to spend all this time making a response video just to have it torn down because I misunderstood what the presenter was saying. So I asked, you present all of this as if it were universally known or self-evident, when these are actually highly contested claims. Knowing and thinking are not the same thing. What one culture believed to be transcendent, objective morality, or even beauty can vary wildly or not exist at all within their conceptual frameworks. Not every culture knew that a God existed. Some were animistic, polytheistic, non-theistic, or treated the divine as a metaphor. Likewise, not every culture affirmed a transcendent layer or objective morality. And free will? That's been debated across philosophical traditions, East and West, with many denying its coherence entirely. So here's my question. Can you demonstrate that these things were known across cultures rather than believed? And more importantly, can you show they're true independently of your own theologically shaped framework? To my surprise, he actually responded to me, so here's his reply, along with my rebuttals. Hi Felicia, I appreciate the thoughtful comment and your good question. As you might know, the argument from Divine Hiddenness is more a family of arguments that vary in their formal form. As Alex did in his full video, which is worth a watch, I generalized a bit to cover more ground. As Alex did, I am pointing to a general drawing of people, I would say, in virtually all cultures prior to modernity, at the very least, the vast majority of them toward the numinous, as Alex said, or the sacred, as Sir Roger Scruton would say. Again, this is just an appeal to popularity. Cultures say things all the time that are accepted as self-evident truths until they aren't. The United States culturally refers to itself as the land of the free, while North Korea insists it's a strong and prosperous nation. But in both cases, the popular slogan is at best misleading and at worst demonstrably false. More importantly, you're being incredibly imprecise in how you frame this. You refer to belief in the numinous as a broad cultural phenomenon, but you're not accounting for the internal diversity within those cultures. You're collapsing all religious or spiritual sentiment into a single category, as if everyone who said they believed in the sacred actually held that belief sincerely, rather than out of social convention, obligation, or survival. Now, even today, some churches hire people based on their willingness to sign a statement of faith. Do we know for sure that 100% of the people that signed that declaration fully believe in that faith, or simply signed it because they were left with no economic alternative? That's the real problem. We currently have no empirical way to separate the true believers from the cultural participants. You're making a sweeping claim about the inner convictions of the vast majority of people across history without any real data to back it up. Let me illustrate my point with an analogy. For the sake of argument, let's suppose I'm pro-Second Amendment. That could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I might be a conspiracy theorist stockpiling weapons to overthrow the government. I might simply want a handgun to defend myself. Or maybe I take an extreme position and think civilians should all be allowed to own nukes. These are radically different stances, but they all fall under the same broader category. So saying most people are pro-Second Amendment tells you almost nothing unless you understand the context of how and why. Your approach to the numinous makes the same mistake. You're lumping everyone who expressed belief in the divine, regardless of what they meant by it, how sincerely they held it, or whether they were just echoing the dominant culture, into a single undifferentiated category. And that flattens the complexity of human belief into a cartoon version of consensus. He continues, I would not claim that all cultures were or are strictly monotheistic, of course. I am also not claiming that because the majority of people have a sense of or draw towards the numinous that this alone proves God exists. What I am pointing out is, I think, worthy of consideration in context of the argument from Divine Hiddenness. If God desires a relationship with people, the existence of some who find it less intuitive or clear or obvious that God exists is not, I think, the logical defeater of God's existence the argument is made out to be. And what I'm pointing out is that you don't actually have any evidence to base your claim on. If the Christian God genuinely desires a personal relationship with every human, and that desire manifests through some universal feeling of the divine, then we should be able to test that in a meaningful empirical way. But as far as I can tell, no such testing has been done. There's no rigorous framework to differentiate true belief, whatever that would mean in this context, another box of worms for another video, from socially convenient belief. There's no test that can reliably separate a sense of the divine from a compelling emotional experience, or frankly, from indigestion. So while I agree with you that the argument from Divine Hiddenness isn't an absolute defeater for the Christian God's existence, your objection doesn't hold up either. You're essentially saying, well, people feel something and that counts for something, without offering a way to distinguish that something from anything else humans are capable of projecting. Look, I need a way to tell the difference between feeling divine and having a really good poop in the morning. Instead, I'd argue that divine hiddenness is better understood as a single data point, a diagnostic tool, not a silver bullet. It's not a standalone refutation of God's existence, but it is useful when evaluating specific theological claims, particularly those that insist God desires a close personal relationship with every human being. And on that note, divine hiddenness isn't really suited for broad brush arguments about God in general. It's a challenge aimed at a very particular model of deity, typically the Christian one, especially when it's claimed that everyone already knows God exists, but denies the truth in their unrighteousness. That's where the argument really has teeth. So yes, I agree. It's not a foundational argument against theism as a whole. But when used in the right context, it raises legitimate and uncomfortable questions that shouldn't be dismissed with vague references to cultural impressions of the numinous. I'm skipping a paragraph here because my answer is literally see previous reply on Argumentum ad Populi, but you can go read the original comment yourself. He continues, I think you are simply right to point out free will has been hotly debated in many times, from John Calvin's theology to old fatalists. I should have left this out of the list, but I think as I was speaking and I was thinking in terms of real moral choices we all have, which of course people have found intuitive throughout history. The pagans and the Christians all believed in virtue, even if they disagreed around the edges. Real moral choices that people have found intuitive throughout history? Well, now we're brushing up against the objective versus subjective morality debate. I'm not trying to derail my entire response video, so I'll keep this as focused as possible. Yes, I agree that some moral choices feel obvious, like you shouldn't eat babies, but even those so-called obvious morals become a lot more complicated when you apply them outside the safe boundaries of modern life. Say your plane crashes in the Canadian wilderness. It's winter, you're stranded, and there's no food. Is it morally acceptable to eat your baby in order to survive? As horrible of a scenario as that is to even think about, the situation forces the question. The baby's unlikely to survive without you anyway, and keeping it alive costs you critical time and energy that you could be putting into survival. I say screw the kid and have yourself one last barbecue before you freeze to death. Now, admittedly, this is not an everyday scenario. It's an extreme edge case, and it is a little bit meant to be humorous. I get that. But it does show how quickly moral absolutes become gray areas when you remove the structures that normally support them. And then there's the question of why these intuitive morals are so human-centered. We recoil at the idea of eating a baby, but many cultures eat salmon roe or balut, a fertilized duck egg with a partially developed embryo. One is treated as horrific, while the other is lunch. The moral line clearly isn't universal or as hard and fast as you would like to think. The deeper issue here is that we call some things intuitive mainly because we can't track their development. We just don't have records going back far enough to know what pre-antiquity humans thought about morality. And we certainly have no idea what kinds of proto-moral frameworks might have existed in our pre-human ancestors. So when people say things like, people have always found these moral choices intuitive, I get cautious. Because no, we don't know that. At best, we know what some cultures believed at certain points in time. That's not the same thing as a universal moral truth, and it's definitely not evidence for the God-derived moral system. So yeah, I'd just be very careful with language like that. If you're going to suggest that certain moral choices are timeless and self-evident, you're going to need more than just cultural memory and intuition to make that case. He continues, when you rightly point out cultures have disagreed on questions of what precisely is moral or what is more beautiful in relation to other moral considerations or other beautiful things, for the particular point being made, it doesn't matter that they all agreed. Even about which god to whom they should offer sacrifice, or if Venus was more beautiful than etc. Rather, I think we hold the peculiar cultural and philosophical leanings in our moment that cause us to question that any of it is real at all. I think this shows our biases and assumptions in a deep divorce with our ancestors from virtually anywhere. Now, you say they all agreed, even while acknowledging that cultures have disagreed on what counts as moral or beautiful, but agreed with what exactly? That humans across cultures and time periods came up with ways to describe things like beauty and morality in ways that made sense to them? Sure, if that's your argument that people created abstract language to communicate complex ideas more efficiently, then yeah, I agree with that. But let's be honest here, you're clearly treating beauty as a metaphysical concept, something real, objective, maybe even divine, and that's where I have to push back. Yes, nearly every culture has some concept of beauty, but the mistake is assuming that those concepts all point to the same thing. They don't. Are we talking about beauty as aesthetic preference? That's explainable through biology and evolution. Preferences for symmetry, color, or fertility signals all tie back to survival and reproduction. No metaphysics required. But if you're arguing that beauty is a universal philosophical abstraction like some kind of Platonic ideal, then no, that idea is very much not universal. That particular framing comes from Greek and Enlightenment thought, and it's not shared across cultures. Take Yoruba aesthetics in Nigeria. Beauty there isn't a singular ideal. It's a mixture of color, character, and cultural custom. There's no one-size-fits-all beauty that maps to the Western concept. Inuit art, entirely different priorities. It's symbolic, spiritual, sometimes intentionally grotesque. The point isn't beauty as ornament, it's spiritual resonance as environmental adaptation. Japanese traditions don't even have a single word for beauty as we use it. Instead, they have multiple overlapping ideas: rustic simplicity, quiet profundity, refined imperfection, all valid aesthetic principles, but none of them line up neatly with the Western idea of beauty. And that's just scratching the surface. Some cultures actually deprioritize or even distrust beauty. Theravada Buddhism treats beauty as an attachment, a form of delusion that distracts from enlightenment. Stoicism and parts of early Christianity warned against being seduced by physical beauty. It was seen as a trap. Puritans, Calvinists, even the Amish, they actively avoided ornamentation, focusing on function and humility. So yeah, no culture is without beauty if all you mean is people used aesthetics to express meaning. But if you're claiming that beauty is some fundamental metaphysical truth that transcends time, culture, and biology, you've got a very long way to go to make that case. He continues, I do of course think that meaning, morality, beauty are real. Plato tended to think of immaterial things as rather abstract objects in Platonic heaven. Aristotle thought the causes were connected to the material world. Classic Christianity, pre-Reformation and Enlightenment, would think incarnationally that realities like beauty are incarnated in the world we experience. So a baby is actually a beautiful and deeply valuable, and we were not merely just evolved to think so. I have to ask, it's 2025. Do you really think that Plato and Aristotle's metaphysics still carry weight in how we actually understand the world? Don't get me wrong, they were foundational thinkers. They gave us early tools to wrestle with questions of meaning, morality, and ontology, but they were also operating with none of the scientific knowledge we have now. No neuroscience, no evolutionary biology, no anthropology, no cognitive science. Their frameworks weren't just speculative, they were rooted in completely pre-scientific understandings of reality. So when you say that you believe that meaning, morality, and beauty are real, I think we have to pause and ask, what do you mean by real? If you're referring to them as subjective experiences, as patterns of meaning we project onto the world, yes, absolutely. These things are real in the sense that we experience them, we value them, and we act on them, but that doesn't make them ontologically independent, floating out there in some metaphysical ether, or, to borrow Plato's model, suspended in Platonic heaven. The Aristotelian framework doesn't help much either. His idea that causes are in the material world might sound more grounded, but it's still tied to a system where things have final causes, a kind of teleology that we now know doesn't track with how the universe actually operates. Natural selection, for example, doesn't aim at any goal. There's no purpose behind why a baby is cute. There's just the fact that parents who found infants adorable were more likely to keep them alive. Now, you bring in classical Christianity and this idea that beauty is incarnated in the world we experience, but that's just another assertion. What does that even mean? That beauty exists as some kind of essence that inhabits objects? You need to show that this metaphysical framework has explanatory power beyond poetic language. Otherwise, it's just another abstraction dressed up in spiritual metaphor. Meanwhile, we do have a source for these kinds of concepts that we can study, test, and continually observe: the human brain. We can identify which areas are active when someone makes a moral judgment. We can track neurological responses to aesthetic stimuli. We can analyze how culture, language, and memory shape what we find beautiful, meaningful, or good. So if you're going to argue that these abstract values are real in a way that exists independently of minds, you've got a major burden of proof to carry, because the far simpler and more evidence-based explanation is that these things don't come from outside us, they emerge from within us. And honestly, that doesn't diminish their importance. It actually makes them more remarkable, in my opinion, because it means that meaning, beauty, and morality aren't imposed on us. They're constructed, negotiated, lived. They're part of how we interact with the world and with each other. And that, to me, is more grounded than pointing to ancient metaphysics that can't be tested, can't be falsified, and haven't held up under modern scrutiny. He continues again, what I'm concerned with at a social level is the impending nihilism rearing its head again, that none of it is real at all, that any meaning or beauty or transcendent are illusory, and hence the baby worth nothing, the waterfall not actually beautiful, murder not actually wrong. This, I'm convinced, leaves us all in a very bad place. You mention impending nihilism as if acknowledging that things like beauty and morality are human constructs means we've plunged headfirst into despair. But here's the problem. You're conflating existence as a social cognitive phenomenon with non-existence altogether. Concepts like meaning, beauty, morality, they do exist, not as physical objects you can hold in your hand, but as tools we use to convey ideas, values, and shared understandings. They're real in the same way language is real. I can't touch justice, but it exists because we talk about it, debate it, and sometimes even agree on what it means. And these concepts evolve actively in our lifetimes. Take Jack Kevorkian. His work sparked a national debate on end-of-life choices, on whether someone has the moral and legal right to choose death in the face of terminal illness and suffering. Before that, the idea of medically assisted death wasn't part of our mainstream moral vocabulary. But we made it one, we debated it, we litigated it, and regardless of whether you agree with the legal outcome, the concept exists because we created it, examined it, and gave it structure. This is how morality actually works, not as a top-down edict from outside reality, but as a peer-to-peer protocol shaped by lived experience and social negotiation. Now let's talk about that waterfall. And listen carefully, because this sounds like nonsense at first, but it's important. Waterfalls don't physically exist. Seriously, what is a waterfall? Is it the cliff, the water, the motion? If you try to treat it as a physical object, the whole definition falls apart. You can't pick it up. You can't move it. You can't isolate it in a lab. A waterfall is an event, not an object. It's a process, a cliff plus water plus gravity plus time. Take away any of those elements and the waterfall disappears. But we all understand what a waterfall is because the concept is useful. It lets us communicate something specific without having to describe the entire physics of flowing water and erosion every time. That's exactly what concepts like beauty, morality, and meaning are. They're shorthand. They don't have to be real in some external metaphysical sense to matter. They're real because we use them, because they carry information, because they help us function. So, no, we're not doomed to nihilism just because we recognize that these values come from us. That's not a loss, that's agency. If anything, the danger isn't that we see these concepts as human-made. The danger is when we pretend they aren't and stop questioning who gets to define them and why. And he concludes, to demonstrate the reality of, say, beauty or morality would take too long for the comment section, but I would recommend, if you are interested, The Abolition of Man by Lewis. I had to read it a couple of times to fully see what he was saying. I was very skeptical at first. It's a difficult text. Michael Ward wrote a book called After Humanity, which is a good guide to the book and explains the concept. As I suggested in the video, ancient pagans too knew that courage was greater than cowardice. If we lose this, we lose too much. Thanks very much for your thoughtful question and taking the time to watch. Have a wonderful night, Felicia. And thank you for the recommendations. I'll go ahead and add The Abolition of Man and After Humanity to my ever-expanding reading list. Seriously, it's getting out of hand. I might need my own librarian soon. I wanted to publish his comment in full, honestly, because he seems like a thoughtful and inquisitive interlocutor, something that's increasingly rare in these conversations. Unlike the usual suspects who just regurgitate the same cookie-cutter apologetics from J. Warner Wallace, Frank Turk, or Darth Dawkins, this guy's actually trying to engage, and to me, that matters. Now, I know I didn't get too deep into his video here. We're only about 4 minutes into a 23-minute long video, and I'm already 10 pages into this response, which translates to roughly 8 hours of recording and editing work. But unfortunately, I've got other things on my plate right now, like studying for a pretty intensive live data modeling interview, so I'll have to stop here for now. But don't worry, I do plan on tackling the rest of his videos soon enough. If you like what you saw, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially if you want me to go deeper into the rest of the video, or if there are other responses you think are worth breaking down in this style. And just a reminder, disagreement doesn't have to mean disrespect. The best conversations aren't the ones where everyone agrees. They're the ones where people actually listen, think, and respond with curiosity. That's the energy I want to keep building here. Yes, I am looking at some of my fellow atheists in this man's comments. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.